In this episode, we're going to focus on a part of security governance that determines whether policies become living expectations or ignored documents, earning real buy-in from the people who must follow, support, and enforce those policies. Buy-in is often misunderstood as getting people to agree with you in a meeting, but true buy-in shows up later, when teams make decisions under pressure and still choose the policy-aligned path. Policies fail most often when they are written in isolation, announced as a finished product, and then met with quiet resistance because stakeholders feel surprised, burdened, or misunderstood. The alternative is to treat policy creation as a collaborative process, where the policy is shaped with the people who know operational reality and validated early enough that problems can be fixed before they harden. Collaboration does not mean letting everyone vote away non-negotiable standards. It means involving the right people early so the policy is both defensible and workable. Early validation means testing assumptions while changes are still easy, so you can build trust and avoid rework later. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. Stakeholders are anyone who is affected by the policy, depends on it, or is responsible for implementing it. And it helps to name that broad reality because buy-in is not only about the people who will execute tasks. Leadership stakeholders care about risk, accountability, and business outcomes, while operational stakeholders care about workload, clarity, and whether the policy fits real workflows. Technical stakeholders may worry about feasibility, architecture constraints, and how the policy will interact with existing systems. Legal and compliance stakeholders may care about evidence, obligations, and consistency. End-user stakeholders may care about friction and whether the policy feels fair. When policy writers ignore any of these perspectives, the ignored group often becomes the source of resistance later, sometimes without even intending to block progress. Buy-in is earned when stakeholders see themselves and their reality reflected in the policy, not when they are merely told to comply. This is why collaboration is not a courtesy. It is a control mechanism that reduces the chance of hidden failure modes. A policy that looks clean on paper but cannot survive stakeholder reality is not a strong policy. It is a weak control disguised as documentation. Collaboration starts with framing, because people cooperate more readily when they understand what problem is being solved and what is not up for negotiation. If you begin collaboration by presenting a draft policy as a finished product, stakeholders feel they have been invited too late, and they often respond with frustration. A better approach is to start with the guiding principle and the risk being addressed, then ask stakeholders to help validate the operational path to achieving that intent. When the intent is clear, stakeholders can contribute without feeling like they are being forced into a mystery requirement. This also helps you separate the non-negotiable outcome from the negotiable implementation path, which keeps collaboration productive. If the policy outcome is to protect sensitive data from unauthorized access, stakeholders can help you design access processes that work, but they should not be asked to debate whether protecting sensitive data is optional. This clarity reduces political friction and prevents collaboration from turning into endless bargaining. The goal is to recruit stakeholders into solving a shared problem, not to recruit them into resisting a mandate. Early validation is the discipline of checking whether policy assumptions match reality before you commit the organization to them. Many policy failures happen because the policy author assumes that certain data is easy to classify, that certain approvals are easy to obtain, or that certain teams have capacity to perform new tasks. In reality, classification may be inconsistent, approvals may be slow, and teams may be overloaded. Early validation exposes these issues while the policy is still flexible. It can be as simple as walking through the policy with stakeholders and asking them to narrate how it would work in their day, where it would create confusion, and where it would create bottlenecks. The point is not to collect opinions in the abstract, but to test the policy against actual workflows. When stakeholders see that you are validating reality rather than defending a draft, they become more willing to engage honestly. That honest engagement is what prevents the policy from becoming a fantasy that only the authors believe. One of the strongest ways to earn buy-in is to treat stakeholders as experts in their own constraints, because operational teams understand the real cost of changes better than policy authors often do. If you dismiss those constraints, stakeholders will assume you do not understand their world, and they will protect themselves by resisting. If you respect those constraints, stakeholders become partners in designing a path that achieves security outcomes while minimizing unnecessary disruption. This is not a compromise on security. It is a recognition that controls must be usable to be effective. Usability in this context includes clarity, feasibility, and the ability to execute under time pressure. When stakeholders raise concerns, you should treat those concerns as risk signals, because a policy that forces unrealistic behavior increases the risk of workarounds. Workarounds are often invisible until an incident reveals them, which is exactly what you want to avoid. Collaboration allows you to design the policy so it reduces the incentive for workarounds by making compliance achievable. Buy-in also depends on fairness, because people are more likely to support policies they believe are applied consistently and justified transparently. If stakeholders suspect the policy will be enforced unevenly, they may resist because they do not want to be the only team paying the cost. Fairness can be strengthened by involving a diverse set of stakeholders early, rather than relying on a single friendly team. When multiple teams participate in shaping the policy, the final result feels less like one team's preference and more like an organizational decision. Fairness also requires consistent language, consistent definitions, and consistent boundaries, because ambiguity creates the perception of unfairness even when no one intends it. When two people interpret a rule differently, one may feel punished while the other feels exempt. Collaboration helps reduce this by surfacing interpretation differences early, before the policy goes live. Early validation, in turn, tests whether the written words produce consistent understanding across roles. Another key element is communication, because buy-in is shaped by how the policy is presented, not just by what the policy says. Stakeholders want to know what problem the policy solves, what will change, when it will change, and what support exists to help them comply. They also want to know what is flexible and what is not, because uncertainty here creates anxiety and resistance. A policy announcement that feels like a surprise, or that feels like security is dumping work on others without support, will trigger defensive behavior. In contrast, communication that reflects the collaborative process, explains the reasoning, and references the validation that was performed tends to feel more trustworthy. It also helps to communicate the policy as part of an outcome story, such as reducing a specific risk or improving reliability, because that connects the cost to a purpose. This is not marketing. It is honest context that helps people decide to participate. When people understand the why, they are more willing to tolerate the inconvenience of the how. Collaboration does not mean endless meetings, and in fact, too much collaboration can create fatigue that harms buy-in. The trick is to collaborate with intention, involving the right stakeholders at the right moments, and using their time efficiently. You can think of collaboration as a series of targeted validation points rather than a long committee process. Early in the process, you validate that the problem is real and that the guiding principles are sound. Next, you validate that the proposed requirements are feasible and that the language is clear. Then, you validate that enforcement and measurement are realistic and fair. Each validation point should produce concrete adjustments or confirmations, not just discussion. When stakeholders see that their input leads to meaningful improvements, they become more invested because they can see that collaboration is not performative. That investment is a form of buy-in because people tend to support what they helped build. At the same time, you must protect the core standards, because buy-in built on weakened controls is not real success. It is deferred failure. Early wins play a role in stakeholder buy-in here as well, because stakeholders trust what they can observe. If a policy is introduced with a visible path to success, including a small early milestone that shows the policy can work without chaos, stakeholders become less fearful. This is not about pretending the policy will be painless. It is about proving that the policy can be implemented in a controlled way. For example, piloting a policy with one willing team and showing how the process works, what friction was discovered, and what was improved can build confidence across the organization. Stakeholders often resist because they imagine worst-case disruption and early validation plus early wins replaces imagination with evidence. When you share what was learned and what was adjusted, you also demonstrate humility and responsiveness, which increases trust. Trust is a core ingredient of buy-in because policies require people to believe that compliance is both expected and supported. Without trust, compliance becomes a game of avoidance. It is also important to design policy buy-in around incentives and constraints rather than relying on goodwill. Most stakeholders are not anti-security, but they are measured on their own outcomes, like uptime, delivery speed, customer satisfaction, or cost control. If a policy threatens those outcomes without offering a workable path, resistance is rational. Collaboration helps you discover these incentive pressures early so you can design implementation paths that align better. For example, if a policy requires more review, you may need to streamline review steps or provide clearer decision criteria so reviews are faster and more predictable. If a policy requires new documentation, you may need to minimize what must be recorded and provide templates that reduce effort. These design moves do not weaken the security outcome. They increase the likelihood of consistent compliance. In a mature governance mindset, making compliance easier is not indulgence. It is strengthening the control by making it repeatable. Stakeholders buy in when the policy respects their reality while still clearly protecting critical outcomes. Another part of buy-in is handling disagreement well, because collaboration often surfaces real conflict between priorities. When disagreement appears, your job is to keep the conversation anchored to principles and measurable outcomes rather than letting it become personal. This is where clear non-negotiables help, because people can argue less about whether a standard applies and more about how to meet it. When stakeholders propose an alternative, you can evaluate it against the guiding principle and the risk outcome, asking whether the alternative achieves the same protection. If it does, you can be flexible, and that flexibility builds trust. If it does not, you can explain why, and then work with them to find a different option. The important point is that you treat objections as input, not as disrespect, while still holding boundaries when necessary. This approach makes stakeholders feel safe to raise concerns early, which is exactly what early validation depends on. When stakeholders stop raising concerns, it often means they have moved from collaboration into quiet resistance. As we close, remember that stakeholder buy-in is not a soft skill separate from security. It is a practical control requirement, because policies only reduce risk when they are followed consistently. Collaboration earns buy-in by involving the people who know operational constraints and by shaping the policy so it fits reality without sacrificing core outcomes. Early validation earns buy-in by testing assumptions before they harden into brittle requirements and by fixing friction before it becomes resistance. Together, these practices reduce ambiguity, reduce rework, and increase trust, which makes policy adoption faster and more durable. For exam thinking, when you see questions about policy success, look for answers that emphasize stakeholder involvement, feasibility, clarity, and evidence-driven refinement rather than top-down declarations. A policy that is built with stakeholders and validated early becomes a shared expectation, not a surprise burden. That is how governance becomes real, and that is how security standards endure under real pressure and real work.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.